Hannah Miller sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment in Madison, Wisconsin, her laptop open, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside her. Outside the window, the late afternoon light rested quietly on the bare branches of early spring. Grace was still at school, and the apartment was unusually silent. Hannah had not planned to read anything important that day. The article had appeared by chance, suggested by the news feed as she scrolled absent-mindedly, killing a few minutes before starting dinner. The headline mentioned a name that meant nothing to her at first. Margaret Collins, founder of a charitable foundation supporting disadvantaged children. Hannah clicked without expectation. The article was written in a restrained, almost understated tone. It spoke of Margaret's work over the past decade of outreach programs, foster placements, medical support for children born into families with no safety net. There were no dramatic claims, no grand speeches, just facts, numbers, quiet accomplishments. The journalist described Margaret Collins as composed, self-possessed, a woman who never raised her voice, yet somehow commanded attention when she entered a room. Hannah scrolled slowly, reading each paragraph more carefully than she intended to. A photograph appeared near the middle of the article. Margaret stood with 3 teenagers, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the youngest. They were not dressed alike. They did not look like a curated family portrait. They looked real, lived in, wanted. Something tightened in Hannah's chest. She enlarged the image without quite knowing why. Margaret Collins was in her early 50s, perhaps older, elegant but not ostentatious. Her face was calm, her expression open. There was a steadiness in her eyes that unsettled Hannah. Not warmth exactly, not softness, something deeper, a kind of restraint that came only from surviving something irreversible. Hannah leaned back in her chair, her fingers still resting on the touchpad. She studied the woman's posture, the angle of her shoulders, the way she stood slightly apart from the children, yet unmistakably anchored among them. A faint, irrational sense of recognition crept over her. She shook her head once, dismissing the feeling. It had been many years. Memory played tricks, especially when life slowed enough to allow it space. Still, she scrolled back up and reread the name. Margaret Collins. The foundation's headquarters were listed in another state, far from Madison. The article continued, detailing how Margaret had personally overseen the adoption of several children considered hard to place. Medical complications, behavioral histories, trauma, children others had passed over. The journalist quoted Margaret directly only once. A simple sentence, carefully chosen. Some children are not difficult, Margaret had said. They are simply waiting to be chosen. Hannah felt her breath catch. She stared at the screen, no longer seeing the words. Only the shape of a memory she had never fully allowed herself to examine. A woman, a stroller, a letter written in careful handwriting, a moment when the ground beneath her life had cracked open and then inexplicably held. She closed her eyes briefly. The apartment remained silent. The past, long contained, stirred. It had always been easier to think of that time as a blur, as survival, as something that happened too quickly and too painfully to analyze. Hannah had never tried to find the woman who had helped them, had never known where to begin. Perhaps she had been afraid of learning the truth. Now, years later, a single question formed, quiet but insistent. Could this be her? Hannah reopened her eyes and looked once more at the photograph. The sense of recognition did not fade. Instead, it deepened, pulling her backward, away from the calm of the present and toward a past she had once believed was sealed. And slowly, without resistance, her thoughts drifted there. Hannah Miller had been born into a part of Madison few people chose unless they had no other option. The neighborhood sat on the edge of the city, a stretch of aging apartment blocks and narrow streets where buildings showed their years through peeling paint and drafty windows. In winter, The cold crept in no matter how tightly the doors were shut. In summer, the walls seemed to trap heat and noise, holding everything close and restless. Her parents lived from one paycheck to the next. Neither of them had finished more than basic schooling. They were not cruel people, and they did not wake each morning intending to fail their child. They were simply tired of work that paid too little, tired of a life that offered no clear way forward. By evening, exhaustion often turned into drinking, and drinking into loud conversations that stretched late into the night. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a living room that doubled as everything else. At night, voices carried easily through the thin walls. Laughter, arguments, the clatter of bottles, sometimes shouting. Hannah learned early how to disappear into the corners of rooms, how to stay quiet enough not to draw attention. Fear was not constant, but it hovered, unpredictable, like weather that could turn without warning. There were days when the household felt almost light. If her parents had managed to earn a little extra, there would be cheap treats from the corner store, soda in dented cans, candy that tasted more like sugar than chocolate. On those evenings, Hannah felt close to happiness, but she also learned that those moments never lasted. Something always followed: noise, strangers, uncertainty. Hannah did not attend preschool. She stayed home alone from an early age, trusted to keep herself occupied while her parents worked or disappeared for hours at a time. She learned to make simple meals, to lock the door, to listen for footsteps in the hallway. The solitude suited her more than the chaos. In silence, she felt safer. It was only when she started school that Hannah understood how different her life was. On her first day, she stood among children whose backpacks were new, whose clothes matched, whose lunches came neatly packed. Hannah's dress had been worn thin, passed down from someone else's child. Her lunch, when she had one, was simple and uneven. She spoke little, unsure of how to bridge the gap between herself and the others. At first, the other children avoided her without malice. They simply did not know where to place her. She smelled faintly of stale air and detergent. She did not talk about vacations or birthday parties or new toys. Hannah watched instead. She observed how they spoke, how they sat, how they carried themselves with an ease she did not recognize. School became a mirror. Through it, she saw clearly what she lacked, rather than hardening her. The realization sharpened her focus. Hannah began to create order where she could. Her desk at home was kept clean even when the rest of the apartment fell into disorder. Her notebooks were carefully organized. She paid attention in class, even when lessons came slowly to her. Some subjects confused her, no matter how much she studied, but effort became her constant. Teachers noticed. They saw a quiet child who tried harder than most, who never caused trouble, who stayed late to ask questions. Encouragement came in small forms: a kind word, a slightly higher grade, an approving nod. Hannah clung to those signs more than she ever admitted. At home, little changed. The nights remained noisy. Money remained scarce. Fear never fully left. But inside Hannah, something had settled into place. She would not stay here. The thought did not arrive as a dramatic declaration. It formed gradually, almost invisibly, growing alongside her discipline. She did not dream of wealth or luxury. She dreamed of stability, of clean rooms, of quiet evenings, of choosing when to speak and when to rest. She learned to keep her hopes private. In her neighborhood, ambition often invited ridicule. Children grew into adults who repeated the same patterns, not because they wanted to, but because no one showed them another way. Hannah watched this happen year after year and felt a widening distance between herself and the world around her. She did not yet know how she would escape. She only knew that she must. And so, while her childhood passed in the shadow of poverty, it also forged something solid within her, a discipline born from necessity, and a quiet determination that would one day carry her far beyond the narrow walls of that apartment. Tragedy did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, spaced just far enough apart to deny Hannah the chance to recover between them. Her father died first. The call came on an ordinary weekday, while Hannah was still in vocational school, sitting through a lesson she barely understood. The words sounded distant, unreal. An accident. Alcohol involved. Nothing could be done. By the time she reached the hospital, it was already over. There was no final conversation, no moment of clarity, just a body that no longer belonged to the man she knew, and a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Her mother unraveled quickly after that. The routines of their life collapsed. Bills went unpaid. Work became irregular. Nights grew longer and louder, then abruptly empty. Hannah watched her mother drift through days with a glassy detachment, speaking less, sleeping in fragments, disappearing for hours. Hannah tried to hold things together in the small ways she knew. Cleaning, shopping, reminding her mother to eat, but she was still a teenager, and the weight was more than she could carry. One winter night, her mother did not come home. Hannah stayed awake until morning, sitting fully dressed on the edge of the bed, listening for footsteps that never came. When the knock finally sounded, it was not her mother standing in the hallway. The explanation was brief, official, final. Exposure. Alcohol. No suffering, they said, as if that detail might help. Hannah had turned 18 only weeks earlier. The timing was cruel in its precision. She was legally an adult, spared the foster system, but that distinction brought no comfort. The apartment, already fragile, became impossible to maintain on her own. Grief hovered, but there was no space for it to settle. There were forms to sign, possessions to pack, decisions to make without guidance. School became a luxury she could no longer afford. Hannah withdrew from vocational training quietly without ceremony. She did not cry when she handed in the paperwork. She felt numb, as if her body had shifted into a mode that allowed only forward motion. Rent had to be paid. Food had to be bought. Bus fare mattered. Survival took precedence over everything else. She took the first full-time job she could find, then another when the first was not enough. The work was physically demanding, long hours on her feet, heavy lifting, repetitive motions that left her muscles aching and her hands raw. She returned home each night exhausted, too tired even to think. The disappointment came later in brief flashes, when she passed the school building on her way to work, when she saw former classmates laughing together, moving toward futures that seemed closed to her now. Hannah allowed herself no more than a moment for those thoughts. Indulgence felt dangerous. She could not afford it. In the quiet hours before sleep, however, she made a promise to herself. She would not live the way her parents had lived. She would not drift from day to day, numbing herself until years disappeared. Whatever happened next, she would choose differently. Even if her choices were limited, she would make them deliberately. The vow was not spoken aloud. It settled inside her, firm and unyielding. Hannah learned quickly how to manage alone. She budgeted carefully, counted every dollar, accepted extra shifts whenever they were offered. She ate simply. She avoided anything that threatened her fragile stability. Alcohol held no appeal for her. She had seen too clearly where it led. Noise made her tense. Disorder unsettled her. She built her life around predictability because it was the only safety she knew. Grief lingered beneath the surface, unprocessed and unnamed. There was no time for counseling, no one to guide her through mourning. Instead, loss became something she carried silently, like a weight she had learned to balance. Yet alongside the exhaustion, a vision persisted. Hannah imagined a life defined by dignity rather than survival, a home that was quiet at night, meals eaten at a table without tension, a future where love did not arrive in chaotic bursts and vanish just as quickly. She did not dream of luxury. She dreamed of consistency, of being able to rest without fear. And one day she dreamed of a family, not the kind she had grown up in, shaped by instability and regret, but one built carefully with intention. A family where care was not accidental, where children were protected rather than endured. At 18, with no safety net and no one to fall back on, Hannah stepped fully into adulthood. She did so without celebration, without guidance, and without complaint. Survival demanded it. What she did not yet know was that this quiet strength, the discipline forged in loss, the resolve shaped by hardship, would soon be tested in ways she could not imagine. Hannah met Jacob Miller on an afternoon that felt unremarkable at first. She had stopped at a small city park after work, sitting on a bench with sore legs and an aching back, letting the noise of the street fade into the background. The air was warm, the kind of early summer day that made people linger outdoors a little longer than usual. She had bought an inexpensive ice cream from a vendor nearby, more out of habit than pleasure, and was eating it slowly, watching families pass by. Jacob sat down beside her without urgency, leaving enough space to avoid intrusion. He smiled, an open, unguarded expression that surprised her. There was nothing polished about him. His clothes were clean but worn, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he had learned early to read a room before settling into it. They spoke easily, without the stiffness Hannah had grown accustomed to in conversations with strangers. Jacob asked simple questions, listened carefully, and did not push for answers when she hesitated. He told her about himself without embellishment. He had lost his mother as a toddler and never knew his father. An aunt had taken him in, not unkindly but without warmth. At 18, he had been told to move out and support himself. He did so without resentment, working steadily, finishing what education he could while earning a living. As he spoke, Hannah felt a quiet recognition. His story mirrored her own in ways that did not require explanation. They understood each other's silences. They both knew what it meant to grow up without a safety net, to step into adulthood before they were ready, to carry responsibility without guidance. Their relationship formed quickly, but not recklessly. It was built on shared routines and quiet evenings, rather than dramatic gestures. Jacob cooked simple meals with care. Hannah cleaned instinctively, organizing their small space until it felt almost peaceful. They talked about practical things, work schedules, rent, plans for the following week. In those conversations, something deeper settled between them. For the first time, Hannah felt what it was like to rest in another person's presence. Jacob was attentive without being overbearing. He noticed when she was tired, when she withdrew, when memories weighed on her. He never demanded explanations. His kindness was steady, not performative. Hannah responded in the only way she knew, by trusting him, slowly, deliberately. When they decided to marry, there was no proposal in the traditional sense. It was a conversation, held late at night over the kitchen table. They spoke about finances, about expectations, about what they wanted their life to look like. Neither had family to gather, no one to impress. A quiet marriage suited them. They signed the papers without ceremony, went out for dinner afterward, and returned home together. It felt enough. Marriage did not change their lives overnight, but it gave them direction. They began saving what little they could, setting aside small amounts with care. Every purchase was considered, every expense weighed. They dreamed not of luxury, but of security, of a home that belonged to them, of stability that did not vanish without warning. When Hannah discovered she was pregnant, the news arrived not with fear, but with a cautious joy that took time to unfold. She told Jacob in the evening, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Jacob listened, then laughed softly, a sound full of disbelief and wonder. He held her carefully, as if afraid the moment might break. Hope, long dormant, stirred. They did not rush into celebration. Instead, they planned. They discussed childcare, medical appointments, savings. Hannah adjusted her work hours. Jacob took on extra shifts when he could. They read what they could find, made lists, asked questions. They wanted to be ready, even if readiness felt elusive. More than anything, they talked about the kind of childhood they wanted for their baby. They imagined quiet nights, regular meals, a home where fear was not constant. They promised each other they would be present, patient, and attentive. They knew they would make mistakes, but they also knew what they would not repeat. Chaos would not define their family. Neglect would not shape their child. For the first time in her life, Hannah allowed herself to believe in something lasting. The future no longer felt like an abstract concept to endure. It became something tangible, something they were building together. Their baby was still only an idea, a heartbeat not yet heard. But already that small, unseen presence had changed everything. What Hannah did not know, what neither of them could anticipate, was how quickly that fragile hope would be tested. The evening began like so many others, without warning or wait. Hannah had finished her shift and returned home early, grateful for the quiet. Jacob had taken an extra driving job, one more late run. One more attempt to put a little more money aside before the baby arrived. He kissed her quickly at the door, promising to be careful, promising he would not stay out too late. The roads were clear. The weather was calm. Nothing suggested that this night would fracture their lives. Hannah was sitting on the couch with her laptop when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. For a moment, she let it ring. Irritation flickering through her fatigue. Then a tightening sensation passed through her chest, sharp and instinctive. She answered. The voice on the other end was strained, hurried. A man introduced himself as someone Jacob worked with, his words tumbling over one another. There had been an accident. On the highway outside the city. Jacob's vehicle had left the road. Hannah did not remember standing up. She only remembered the sound of her own breath, loud and uneven, as she asked the same question again and again. Was he alive? The drive to the hospital blurred into fragments, streetlights streaking past the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her fingers ached. At the emergency entrance, the smell of disinfectant and cold air hit her all at once. She gave Jacob's name to the intake desk, her voice barely steady enough to be understood. They told her to wait. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. Hannah paced the hallway, her thoughts colliding and scattering. Images came unbidden. Jacob smiling over dinner, Jacob folding tiny baby clothes with awkward care, Jacob's hand resting protectively at the small of her back. She pressed her palm to her stomach, as if anchoring herself to the present. When the doctor finally approached, his expression was controlled, professional. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. Jacob had survived the impact. The injuries were severe. Spinal trauma, internal damage. They had stabilized him, done what they could. Surgery had been necessary, and more procedures might follow. The next days would be critical. Hannah nodded as though she understood everything, though much of it passed through her like noise. One phrase lingered, heavy and unmistakable. Possible permanent disability. She was allowed to see Jacob briefly. He lay motionless, machines humming around him, his face pale beneath the harsh hospital lights. Tubes and wires obscured the man she knew, but his breathing was steady, alive. That fact alone kept her upright. She held his hand, careful not to disturb anything, and whispered words she could not remember later. Promises, reassurances. She stayed until a nurse gently told her visiting hours were over and guided her back into the hallway. It was only when Hannah stepped outside into the night air that the full weight of what had happened began to descend. Calls followed, paperwork, questions she could barely process. Someone mentioned insurance. Someone else asked about liability. The truck Jacob had been driving was damaged beyond repair. Cargo had been lost. Contracts mattered. Responsibility was discussed in careful, impersonal terms. Hannah listened, numb. Jacob had been the primary source of income. His wages paid the rent, covered groceries, allowed them to save just enough to feel cautiously hopeful. Hannah's own earnings were modest, already strained by medical appointments and reduced hours. Now everything had shifted. Medical bills began to appear almost immediately. Explanations of benefits that explained nothing. Notices she did not yet understand. She learned new terms: deductibles, coverage limits, rehabilitation. Each one carried a cost. She sat at the small kitchen table late into the night, sorting through papers with shaking hands. Numbers refused to align. Even the most conservative estimates felt impossible. Rent was due. Utilities waited. The baby would arrive whether they were ready or not. Uncertainty pressed in from every side. Hannah tried to remain practical. She made lists. She returned calls. She asked questions when she could gather the strength to speak. But beneath the effort, fear spread steadily, seeping into every thought. Jacob was alive. That mattered. It had to matter. Yet, as Hannah lay awake in the dark, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside the apartment, she could not ignore the truth forming quietly in her mind. The life they had been building, the careful plans, the fragile sense of security, had been torn open in a single, ordinary evening, and she had no idea how to hold it together. The body reacted before Hannah's mind could make sense of what was happening. The days following the accident blurred together into a cycle of hospital corridors, unanswered questions, and restless nights. Hannah moved between Jacob's bedside and their apartment, carrying the weight of fear in her chest like something physical. She slept in fragments, waking to panic, to the echo of medical terms she did not yet understand. Each visit to the hospital left her more exhausted than the last, but she forced herself to remain composed. Jacob needed calm. Their unborn child needed stability. It was not enough. One morning, as Hannah was standing in the hospital parking lot, her phone pressed to her ear. A sudden pain seized her abdomen, sharp, undeniable. She froze, breath catching as another wave followed. For a moment, she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Stress, fatigue, imagination. Then her knees buckled, and the world tilted violently out of place. By the time she reached the emergency room, the truth could no longer be denied. She was in labor. Too early. The hours that followed unfolded in fragments. Bright lights, urgent voices, hands guiding her onto a gurney. Someone asking how far along she was. Someone else asking where her husband was. Hannah answered automatically, her voice distant even to her own ears. Jacob was still recovering. Jacob could not come. She was alone. The delivery room was filled with movement and controlled urgency. Doctors spoke in calm, measured tones, explaining risks, outlining procedures, offering reassurances that sounded fragile even as they were spoken. Hannah focused on breathing, on staying present, on the faint hope that her body would hold on just a little longer. It did not. When Grace Miller was born, there was no immediate cry, only the swift, practiced motion of medical staff lifting her away. Hannah caught a brief glimpse, small, impossibly small, before her daughter disappeared behind a cluster of scrubs and equipment. The silence that followed was unbearable. Hannah lay back against the pillow, her body shaking, her heart pounding with a terror she could not articulate. She asked if her baby was alive. The answer came quickly, efficiently. Yes, but she needed help. A lot of help. Grace was rushed to the neonatal intensive care unit. When Hannah woke later, the room was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Machines hummed softly around her bed. Tubes traced paths along her arms. The absence beside her was louder than any sound. No baby. No Jacob. Just space. A nurse explained what had happened, repeating information Hannah barely absorbed. Grace was stable but fragile. Her lungs were underdeveloped. She would need to remain in the NICU for the foreseeable future. Days, perhaps weeks. They would monitor her constantly. There were no guarantees. Hannah nodded, her throat tight. She asked when she could see her daughter. When she was wheeled into the NICU, the sight nearly undid her. Grace lay inside an incubator, her tiny body connected to wires and monitors that dwarfed her. Her skin was translucent, her chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. Hannah pressed her hand against the glass, afraid to touch, afraid to hope. Grace was alive. That fact became the axis around which everything else turned. Jacob's condition had stabilized, but the reality of his injuries became clearer with each passing day. He could not stand. He could not walk. Doctors spoke carefully, outlining possibilities rather than promises. Rehabilitation would be long and uncertain. Mobility might improve. But no one could say how much. Jacob was moved to a wheelchair. Hannah saw the weight of that moment settle over him, even as he tried to mask it. He smiled when she entered the room, asked about Grace, asked about her recovery. He did not ask about himself. But Hannah saw the way his hands tightened on the armrests, the way his gaze lingered on his unmoving legs. The family they had imagined, active, self-sufficient, steady, slipped further out of reach. Bills multiplied with alarming speed. Hospital stays, surgery, NICU care, physical therapy. Insurance covered some costs, but not all. Statements arrived thick with numbers and unfamiliar terminology. Each envelope carried a fresh wave of dread. Jacob could not work. His income vanished overnight. Hannah realized, slowly and painfully, that everything now depended on her. She would have to return to work as soon as her body allowed. She would have to manage appointments, paperwork, transportation care. She would have to be present for Jacob and Grace while holding their lives together with sheer endurance. Exhaustion settled into her bones. There were moments, brief, private ones, when despair threatened to overwhelm her. In the quiet hours, when Grace slept behind glass and Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Hannah felt the full weight of their situation pressed down on her chest. Fear became constant, a low, steady hum beneath every thought. Yet she did not collapse. Instead, Hannah learned to function on determination alone. She moved through days with mechanical precision, conserving energy, making decisions, pushing grief aside. There would be time for tears later, she told herself. There had to be. For now, survival demanded everything she had. And so, as her daughter fought for each breath and her husband adjusted to a body that no longer obeyed him, Hannah stepped fully into a role she had never imagined. Sole provider, caretaker, and anchor for a family standing on the edge of collapse. The despair was quiet, the fear relentless, and still she endured. The evening Hannah noticed the stroller had already drained what little strength she had left. She had returned home later than usual, her body aching from a full shift followed by a visit to the hospital. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot behind their apartment building. The dumpsters stood near the far fence, surrounded by cracked pavement and scattered leaves, a place people passed without looking twice. As Hannah crossed the lot, her attention caught on movement near the bins. A woman stood there, older, well-dressed, unmistakably out of place. Her coat was tailored, her shoes clean, her posture composed. She did not belong to this neighborhood. Hannah slowed her steps, instinctively wary. The woman set something carefully on the ground beside the trash containers, adjusted it with deliberate care, and glanced around once, as if confirming she was not being watched. Then she walked away. Hannah stopped. For a moment, she considered continuing on, telling herself it was none of her business. But the shape beside the bins held her gaze. A baby stroller, large, modern, unmistakably expensive. Its fabric was spotless. The metal frame gleamed faintly in the fading light. There were no stains, no signs of wear. It looked as though it had never been used. Hannah stood still, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. She waited. Minutes passed. No one returned. The woman did not reappear. Hannah glanced toward her building, then back at the stroller. Pride rose reflexively, sharp and insistent. This was not for her. She had managed so far without asking for charity. She could continue, but the image of Grace in the NICU, surrounded by machines, intruded on her thoughts. The list of things they could not afford was long and growing. A stroller had been far down that list, an item she had quietly accepted they would never have. Hannah approached slowly, half expecting someone to stop her, to call out, to claim a mistake. No one did. She touched the handle lightly, as if testing whether it was real. It was sturdy, solid beneath her hand. She checked for damage. There was none. No tag, no note, nothing to explain why it had been left there. She stood there longer than necessary, wrestling with herself. The idea of taking something that was not explicitly offered felt wrong, but leaving it behind felt worse. Wasteful. Unthinkable. In the end, desperation outweighed pride. Hannah folded the stroller with practiced care and wheeled it toward the building, her pulse loud in her ears. She half expected someone to confront her at the door. No one did. The stairwell was empty. The apartment was quiet when she entered. Jacob looked up from the couch as she set the stroller down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Where did that come from?" he asked finally, his voice cautious. Hannah explained, choosing her words carefully. She did not embellish, did not dramatize. She simply described what she had seen. Jacob listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the stroller. He reached out and ran his hand along the fabric, as if confirming what his eyes already told him. "It's new," he said softly. "I know," Hannah replied. They stood there for a long moment, suspended between disbelief and relief. Hannah felt a tightening in her chest she could not name. She told herself this was practical, nothing more. A necessity. Later that evening, after dinner, Hannah began cleaning the stroller, wiping it down despite its pristine condition. The repetitive motion calmed her. Jacob watched from the couch, his hands resting on his knees. As Hannah folded the canopy, Jacob noticed something tucked into the side pocket. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against paper. "There's something here," he said. He pulled out a folded letter. The envelope was unmarked. No name, no return address. The paper inside was thick, the kind chosen intentionally. Hannah stopped what she was doing, her breath catching as Jacob unfolded it carefully. They exchanged a glance, uncertain, uneasy. Jacob began to read. Neither of them knew it yet, but in that quiet room, with the evening settling around them and the stroller standing silently between them, the course of their lives had begun to shift. The letter was written in a steady, deliberate hand. Each line was neat, carefully spaced, as if the writer had taken her time, choosing every word with intention. Jacob read aloud while Hannah sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "To the people who have found the stroller, if you are reading this letter, then the stroller has finally reached the child it was meant to serve. That thought brings me a quiet sense of peace. My name is Margaret Collins. I am writing this not because I expect anything in return, but because I believe that some stories need to be told, even to strangers, perhaps especially to strangers. I was born into comfort. My parents were successful, disciplined, ambitious people who believed deeply in achievement. From an early age, I learned that security came from control over circumstances, over emotions, over outcomes. I excelled in school, built a career in finance, and learned quickly how to win in rooms full of powerful people. For many years, I believed I was fulfilled. Work was not just something I did, it was who I was. I traveled constantly, managed portfolios, spoke at conferences, and built a reputation for calm authority. People listened when I spoke. They trusted my judgment. I told myself that I was making an impact, that my work mattered. Children, I believed, could wait. I watched friends step away from their careers, their conversations narrowing to diapers, sleep schedules, and exhaustion. I told myself I was different, more focused, more disciplined. I said I would become a mother someday when the timing was right, when I had accomplished enough to deserve it. I did not realize that time does not negotiate. By the time I truly wanted a child, I was no longer young. At first, I was unconcerned. I had always succeeded through effort and persistence. I assumed this would be no different. It was. Years passed. Doctors' offices replaced conference rooms. Charts and test results replaced quarterly reports. Every month brought hope, followed by disappointment. I learned the language of infertility far more intimately than I ever wanted to. Procedures, hormones, waiting rooms filled with women pretending not to cry. I became angry at my body, at women for whom pregnancy came easily, at myself for having waited, at the world for not bending, for once, to my will. My husband, Victor, tried to be patient. He suggested alternatives, adoption, fostering, letting go. I rejected them all. I wanted my child, my blood, my proof that I had not waited too long. Eventually, against all odds, I became pregnant. I believed I had finally won. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Complications appeared early. Bed rest became mandatory. Doctors warned me repeatedly that my body was under severe strain, that continuing the pregnancy carried serious risks. I listened, and I did not listen. I told myself that modern medicine could handle anything, that women gave birth under far worse circumstances, that the pain, the fear, the warnings were temporary obstacles standing between me and the life I had waited for. I was wrong. My son was born far too early. I saw him only briefly, small, fragile, surrounded by machines and wires that seemed larger than his body. I remember his hand, no bigger than my thumb, and the impossible weight of love and terror that flooded me all at once. He lived only a few days. When he died, something inside me collapsed. I had prepared for motherhood in every practical way. The nursery was complete. Clothes were folded. Toys were arranged. The stroller you now have was chosen after weeks of research. I wanted only the best. I wanted to give him everything. What I had not prepared for was grief. The world did not end, but my identity did. I was no longer the woman who knew exactly who she was. I was no longer the professional who solved problems efficiently. I was a mother without a child, trapped in a house full of reminders. I blamed myself. I blamed the doctors. I blamed my ambition. I blamed my body for failing me and my son for leaving me. None of that made sense, and all of it felt true at once. Therapy came next, reluctantly at first. I was forced to sit still with questions I had avoided my entire life. Why had I waited? Why had I believed success could replace connection? Why had I dismissed motherhood as something I could schedule? I began to see myself clearly, perhaps for the first time, not as a villain, but as someone who had misunderstood what mattered. I could not save my son. That truth was unbearable. But slowly, painfully, another truth emerged. There were children in the world who were alive, breathing, waiting, and who had been abandoned not by choice but by circumstance. At first, the idea of helping other children felt like betrayal, as if loving them meant replacing my son. It took time to understand that love is not a finite resource. I began visiting shelters, then foster homes, then hospitals. I listened to stories I could not forget. Children born into poverty, illness, neglect, violence. Children no one was waiting for. Helping them did not erase my grief, but it gave it direction. The stroller remained untouched for years. It stayed in storage, pristine and unused. When I found it again, I did not feel the sharp pain I once had. Instead, I felt something quieter. Resolve. I did not want to donate it anonymously to an organization where it would disappear into inventory. I wanted it to go to a family who needed it desperately. A family who had not planned perfectly. A family who was doing their best under impossible circumstances. I watched. I waited. I trusted instinct over logic. When I saw you, I knew. You did not see me watching. I saw exhaustion, fear, and love all at once. I saw a child held close, and a man trying to be strong in a body that had betrayed him. I heard fragments of conversation about medical appointments, about money, about a stroller you could not afford but clearly needed. The stroller alone was not enough. I knew that. I chose to leave it where pride would not interfere. I hoped the letter would explain what my silence could not. If you are reading this, please know this. You did nothing wrong by taking it. It was meant for you. Your child deserves a beginning that is not defined solely by hardship. You deserve help that comes without judgment. If you choose to accept what else I have left nearby, do so without shame. Use it to heal, to rebuild, to survive. That is what it is for. My son's life was brief, but it does not have to be meaningless. If his existence allows other children to grow, to be loved, then his legacy lives on. I wish you strength, dignity, and the quiet courage it takes to keep going when the future feels impossible. Margaret Collins. When Jacob finished reading, the room was silent. Hannah felt tears sliding down her face, but she did not wipe them away. For the first time in months, the weight pressing on her chest felt different, not lighter, but steadier. The letter rested in her hands like something fragile and powerful at once. And suddenly, the stroller was no longer just an object. It was a bridge between two lives, broken in different ways, reaching toward each other in the dark. The final paragraph of the letter was brief, almost cautious in its wording. Margaret did not give an address, only directions, carefully phrased, as if she were afraid of being too explicit. She mentioned an unfinished commercial building not far from where the stroller had been left, a place abandoned mid-construction years earlier. Beneath the concrete steps at the back entrance, she wrote, there was something else meant for them. Hannah read the lines twice, then a third time. Jacob looked up at her from the wheelchair, his expression unreadable. "Do you think she's serious?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Hannah answered. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. But everything else was real. The stroller, the letter, all of it. They did not speak for a long moment after that. Grace slept in the small crib beside the couch, her breathing soft and rhythmic. The apartment was dim, the single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the city had settled into its late-night hush. Finally, Jacob nodded. "Then let's go." They moved carefully, quietly, as if afraid the moment might break if they spoke too loudly. Hannah bundled Grace into a warm blanket and settled her into the stroller. Jacob maneuvered himself into position, practiced and efficient despite the strain. Neither of them mentioned the fear lingering just beneath the surface, the possibility of disappointment, of hope turning into something dangerous. The abandoned building stood only a few blocks away. Once it had been meant to house a grocery store, perhaps a pharmacy. Now it was little more than a concrete shell, fenced off and forgotten. The streetlights nearby flickered unevenly, illuminating cracked pavement and weeds pushing through seams in the ground. Hannah stopped at the edge of the property. She scanned the shadows instinctively, her pulse quickening. "What if this is a mistake?" she whispered. Jacob shook his head. "We'll look. That's all." They circled the structure slowly until they reached the back. The steps Margaret had described were there, unfinished, rough concrete leading to a door that had never been installed. Beneath them, a dark recess opened like a shallow cave. Jacob leaned forward, bracing himself, and reached beneath the lowest step. His fingers brushed against something firm and smooth. He paused, then pulled carefully. A package emerged, wrapped tightly in thick plastic and sealed with tape. It was heavier than Hannah expected, much heavier. They stared at it in silence. Hannah lowered herself onto the step, her knees suddenly weak. Jacob placed the bundle on the ground between them and began peeling away the layers with slow, deliberate movements. The sound of tape tearing echoed softly in the empty space. Inside were stacks of cash, neatly arranged, protected from moisture, carefully prepared. Hannah gasped, the sound catching in her throat. For a moment, she could not make sense of what she was seeing. Her mind tried to calculate, to rationalize, but the numbers overwhelmed her. This was not a small sum. This was not charity in the casual sense. This was salvation. Jacob closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, as if to confirm the reality of it. "It's real," he said quietly. "All of it." Hannah pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears came freely now, not sharp or desperate, but heavy with relief. The kind of tears that followed endurance, stretched beyond its limits. They did not laugh. They did not shout. They did not celebrate. They sat there in the darkness, holding hands, listening to Grace's soft breathing from the stroller. The city went on around them, unaware. Cars passed in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent again. Margaret's words returned to Hannah with sudden clarity. Use it to heal, to rebuild, to survive. This was not justice delivered with witnesses or applause. There would be no acknowledgement, no gratitude expected or requested. No one would ever know what had been given here, beneath a forgotten building on an unremarkable street. And that, Hannah realized, was the point. They repacked the money carefully, exactly as they had found it. When they finally turned back toward home, the night felt different, not brighter, but steadier. The weight they carried was no longer unbearable. For the first time since the accident, since the hospital rooms and the machines and the fear, Hannah allowed herself to imagine a future that did not end in collapse. Not a perfect one, but a possible one. Time moved forward, quietly, without ceremony. Rehabilitation was long and uncertain, but Jacob endured it with the same steady patience that had carried him through everything else. Progress came slowly, first small movements, then standing, then walking with assistance. Months passed, then years. He never fully returned to the man he had been before the accident, but he reclaimed something just as important: independence. By the time Grace started kindergarten, Jacob could walk unassisted, his limp slight but permanent, a reminder rather than a limitation. Grace grew strong. The fragile infant who had once been surrounded by wires and monitors became a healthy, curious child with bright eyes and boundless questions. Doctor visits became routine rather than urgent. Medications gave way to vitamins. Fear loosened its grip, little by little. The Millers' life was modest. They never became wealthy. They did not try to. They owned a small home in a quiet neighborhood, paid for carefully over time. Jacob worked again, different work, safer work. Hannah returned to school in the evenings and earned certifications that allowed her to move into steadier employment. Their days were ordinary in the best possible way. And yet, not a single year passed without Hannah thinking of the woman who had altered their future without ever asking to be known. She never forgot the letter. It stayed in a drawer in their bedroom, folded and refolded so many times the creases had softened. Grace learned the story early, not as a burden, but as a reminder. That kindness existed. That survival was sometimes a gift passed quietly from one stranger to another. When Grace was nearly 17, Hannah found the article. It was longer than the one she had read years before, more reflective. Margaret Collins had agreed to a full interview, marking the Foundation's anniversary. The piece explored not only the work itself, but the moment that had shaped everything that followed. Hannah read slowly, her heart steady but attentive. Margaret spoke openly about loss, about her son, about the years when grief had hollowed her out and left her searching for meaning. She described the beginning of the Foundation, the first foster placements, the nights she had questioned whether any of it mattered, Then came the part Hannah had never expected to see in print. Margaret described a young family she had seen in a city park many years earlier. A woman holding an infant too small for her age. A man in a wheelchair, forcing a smile through exhaustion. A conversation overheard, not intentionally, but clearly enough to understand the stakes. "I knew they wouldn't ask," Margaret told the interviewer. "People like them never do. So I had to choose them myself." Hannah closed her eyes. Margaret explained how she had followed them at a distance, how she had waited, how she had planned the placement of the stroller and the money with care. She spoke of the letter as something she had written not only for them, but for herself, a way to release what she could not carry anymore. "I never wanted to be thanked," Margaret said. "I only wanted to know that something good came out of what we lost." Hannah finished the article with tears on her face, not from grief this time, but from recognition. The last uncertainty dissolved. The woman she had wondered about for years had been real, intentional, present. That night, Hannah sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She wrote for hours. She told Margaret everything. About the accident, the hospital, the fear. About the stroller and the letter and the money found beneath the abandoned store. About Jacob learning to walk again. About Grace's first steps, first words, first day of school. She attached photographs. A family at the beach, Grace at graduation, Jacob smiling without strain. At the end, Hannah wrote only one thing. "You saved more than a family. You changed what came after us." She pressed send and sat back, exhausted and peaceful. Whether Margaret would respond did not matter. The truth had completed its circle. A kindness given in silence had echoed forward, shaping a life that would shape another, and another after that. No witnesses, no recognition, just a future rewritten by someone who chose to see and to act when it mattered most.